Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable Member Holly Walker.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak a little bit further to the supplementary order paper number 77, which has been such point of contention so far in the debate. And I want to thank the member Jacinda Ardern for her contribution earlier and her suggestion about splitting this amendment into two separate supplementary order papers, which I have done and will table on the House at the conclusion of my call. And the reason for doing that, I think, is as outlined by Jacinda Ardern, relates to the Minister's justification given for the financial veto, because it seemed to me that a large emphasis was placed in that justification on the changes relating to what would be new clause 35A relating to the recovery of debts. So I've separated that into a separate supplementary order paper, so if the Minister would like to use her discretion, as we would like to offer the same discretion to the Chief Executive of Work and Income to take the impact on children into account, then she's able to do so in considering these two amendments. Separately, Mr. Chair, I just want to speak a little bit to the implications of what it means if the government decides to apply its financial veto to both of these amendments and extrapolate out and perhaps tease out a little bit for the benefit of the House and those listening what exactly they have conceded in choosing to apply the financial veto to these amendments. Because as we've heard from the Minister, she believes that that there could be, I think, in relation to both the recovery of debts and to the imposition of sanctions, if Work and Income was not able to do those things, to recover those debts or to impose those sanctions, there would be a financial cost to the Department of doing that. That's true, and I accept the Minister's rationale on that, but I think it's very important that we tease out the conditions in which those sanctions or that debt recovery would not be applied and look at the wording of the supplementary order paper, because it says that it would be in situations when it may deprive the child of food and shelter or would otherwise be detrimental to the well-being of the child. Now, the Minister has assumed that this supplementary order paper would not allow WINS to apply sanctions or recover debt in any situation ever. She's assumed that it would rule out all circumstances of WINS being able to do that. And what that means is that the government has effectively acknowledged in exercising its financial veto that to do so would deprive the child of food and shelter and would deprive children of the well-being of the child. So what the government has basically admitted is that the provisions in the bill as it is currently drafted before the committee, the sanctions that it would impose on sole parents would be detrimental to the well-being of children, because if we had an amendment that gave WINS the discretion not to do it, the government has assumed they wouldn't do it. Let's just think about that for a minute. If we gave WINS the discretion not to apply sanctions because it might be harmful to children, the government has assumed that WINS would take that discretion and not apply those sanctions. Well, Mr. Chair, what does that tell you about the sanctions in the bill? It tells you that they would deprive children of food and shelter and would be detrimental to the well-being of children. That is what the government has admitted in choosing to use its financial veto on these provisions. And that is significant, Mr. Chair. That means the government, despite using the rationale of trying to improve outcomes for children as part of the rationale for even making these welfare reforms in the first place, has acknowledged by way of this financial veto that in fact the sanctions are detrimental to children and would deprive them of such basics as food and shelter. And Mr. Chair, that is extremely concerning, both from a child perspective and, as I mentioned earlier, from a perspective of our international obligations and making sure that we meet our international obligations under the International Convention of the Rights of the Child, which states that the affected citizen in need of social security needs to be able to support themselves and their children. And so what we have effectively had from the government is an admission that the sanctions in this bill deprive people of the ability to supply the basics for their children. And that is very concerning. That means that when the sanction regime outlined under this bill is applied, parents will no longer be able to supply their children with the basics, with food, with shelter, with a warm, dry home, with clothes, with shoes, with raincoats. And Mr. Chair, I've just been sitting And I'm looking forward also later on tonight to hearing from Julie Chapman Helson, who's the Chief Executive of Kids Can. And she's coming to speak to a cross-party group of MPs. Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Minister Paula Bennett.
Mr Chairman,